Meeting is called to order. Good morning and welcome to the August 10th meeting of the Douglas County Criminal Justice Court and Council. My name is Pam Weechen and I'm the chair of the CJCC. I want to pass a bit of information along regarding how we will conduct our meeting on Zoom today. We ask that all members please turn on video if you have it. We ask that all members and presenters use good conference etiquette and mute their line when not speaking. We ask that you please identify yourself each time you speak. If you have a public comment to make during the public comment section of the agenda, please use the raise your hand function on Zoom. And then Mike and I will be tracking the hands raised and watching for time to try and keep us on track today. A recording of the CJCC meetings is available on the CJCC website after each meeting. Our first agenda item today is a presentation by Dr. Jack McDevitt with Northeastern University and Dr. Janice Iwoma with American University regarding the law enforcement contact study.
So I'll do a brief introduction. This is Mike Brower, and we want to thank Dr. McDevitt and Dr. Iwoma, who presented to us before, but it's been some time as they've been quarantined in the Northeast, but just meet with us on Zoom and working on our data. They've been here since Sunday, meeting with our law enforcement agencies. We got a few more meetings yet today, and they participated in the community listening session last night. So I'm going to let Dr. McDevitt start out and kind of introduce the project and take it from there. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Pam. My name is Jack McDevitt. I'm a director of the Institute for Race and Justice at Northeastern University in Boston. My colleague, Janice Iwoma, is from American University. We're going to be showing you some data and the structure of the analysis we've been doing since 2020 to take a look at traffic enforcement in Douglas County. Go to the next slide. So just to give you some background, one of the things that's different about what's happening in Douglas County is that the agencies in Douglas County asked for this analysis. We do analyses like these all across the country, and most often there's been a lawsuit or a state statute that requires agencies to collect this data. And as opposed to that, Douglas County has been proactive and came forward and said, we'd like to know more about traffic stops that are being conducted in the county. And all of the agencies in the county participated and have started collecting data. When I say that, I mean that it has to be a little bit more than just what normal agencies collect in traffic stops. So you have to collect data on every traffic stop you do. So it's more onerous for the departments to do this. But Douglas County has decided that it's worth it to understand if there are any racial or ethnic disparities that is involved in the traffic enforcement in Douglas County. We're seeing more interest in this as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement last summer. More agencies are starting to see that traffic enforcement is important. It's an important place where agencies interact with the public, and they are seeing that this is something that we want to know more about. It is something that most agencies sort of do as a matter of course, but don't analyze in detail why and how their offices, stop people for traffic violations. So this allows them to do that. I wanted to juxtapose what's happening in Douglas County with what's happening elsewhere in the country. Janice and I have gotten outreach from counties such as West Palm Beach in Florida and Hillsborough County, Florida. And when the community members asked that the police would collect this data, the police have said no, that they didn't think it was worth it, and it's not something that they were concerned about. So I do think that you should feel good about the fact that this is a unique environment for this, as opposed to some of the places around the country. But it does fit within an ongoing conversation about the proper role of police. I know you're having this conversation in Douglas County with the different kinds of police agencies, but what should the role of police be? When should police be using force? And also a major one, and I know that there's some initiatives in Douglas County to deal with this, is to how and when should police respond to mental health calls? So there's this whole new questioning of what the proper role of police is in our society. And what we think we can do with this study is to talk about the right role for police in traffic enforcement. and how best to do that in a fair and impartial way. Go on to the next one. So the scope of the study, we're at a sort of really interesting point in the study now. I know I'm a data geek, so I apologize for that, but we started out planning it, designing the data collection form, training the agencies to collect the data. And then we did data collection. And the data collection should have been done earlier, except for we had COVID. And all across the country, the COVID that we had reduced the number of stops the police departments were making. Sometimes as much as 90% reduction in the number of traffic stops. So what we had calculated to have enough stops to conduct a statistically relevant analysis was delayed. So now we do feel like we have enough data to be able to report some of the first findings of this. Now, what we designed the study, how we designed the study and what we're looking for is, what we're going to report today is county level data on stops and also disparities. But we're also doing, as Mike mentioned, is we're going to each police agency in the county, giving them their individual data and starting a conversation on, if there are disparities, how might we identify the cause of those disparities, whether it's an individual officer or a type of stop or in a section of a city, and how might then they have a plan of action to address any disparities that might not be able to be explained.
So in providing you with a better understanding on the timeline for the study, in May of 2019, we introduced the study plan to the CJCC, to this body and law enforcement agencies in order to identify what were some of the biggest issues. Of course, we developed a stop data collection form that matched that of the needs of the community and the stops that would exist in this part of the community. Like so many other types of cities, there are different types of stops due to the nature of the different characteristics of the streets, the individuals. Right around the same time period, we started developing guidelines, training, and an auditing process. In order to ensure that the data was as accurate as possible, we allowed some room for data collection in order to audit and make sure that the numbers that were coming in matched those of what the agencies expected. So we began collecting the data by early of September of 2019 through the end of December of 2019 to ensure that those numbers matched those of what law enforcement agencies expected. Therefore, the official data collection began by January 1 of 2020, which is what is part of the data that we will be showing you today through the end of July of 2021. Of course, with March of 2020, something unexpected, as Jack illustrated, something that several other law enforcement agencies across the country also dealt with, was the stay-at-home orders that were issued at some of the city levels and the county levels. So as Jack noted, there were huge reductions the last week of March and early April that led us to reconsider filing for an extension for the study to ensure that by the time we submitted a final report, we had an accurate picture of what might happen. Of course, moving forward, some of the considerations we're taking into place are what are some of the effects from major events such as the pandemic on the stop activity that took place in Douglas County. So this illustrates sort of an image of the stop data collection form that we developed. This is a form that we've gone over with all members of the CJCC, and we've gone over with law enforcement agencies. This sort of just illustrates the form that law enforcement agencies are using in their systems in order to collect the information. And we'll go over some of the characteristics of stops that are collected through this stop data collection form.
So here are some of the examples of the kind of data that we are collecting. The reason for the stop, what was the stop for? Was it for speeding? Was it for an equipment violation? Something like that. And one of the things that we did was to think about which stops are more discretionary. In other words, in some kinds of stops, if someone's driving down the street hitting other cars, the police are going to pull them over no matter what race or ethnicity they are. But what we call high discretion stops, we wanted to understand, are those stops different in terms of who's being pulled over? And so, for example, in what we've done in this data set is to say stops for people speeding 10 miles or more over the speed limit are different from stops that are for people less than 10 miles over the speed limit. So we look at reason for the stop and how much discretion that stop should be. We look at the basis of the stop, the duration of the stop, and the outcome of the stop. And as you'll see, the outcome of the stop involves whether a citation or a warning was issued or an arrest was made. We also look at the characteristics of who was searched. Throughout all the literature that has been done on racial profiling across the country, we see that searches are one place where disparities consistently are found in who's searched, are less consistency in sort of who stopped, but in terms of who's searched, people of color are more likely to be searched than white folks. And we're going to talk a little bit about the characteristics of the driver. The next slide. Oh, and so as what we've done is started a conversation with each of the agencies and with the CJCC to start to talk about if we have disparities, and we'll show you some of them today, how do we understand those disparities and develop a plan for departments to drill down and to address any disparities that they can't figure out why they're happening? So when we say drill down, we're going to take a look at are people of color being stopped at certain times of the day? Are they being stopped at certain areas of the city? Are they being stopped in certain kinds of stops? As I said, high discretion stops. Are they more likely to be stopped in high discretion stops? And we're going to look at benchmarks that compare officers in one agency to the other officers who work in that agency. So those are the kind of drilling down that we've been starting conversations with all the groups of, so that we can get an idea about what people think are the reasons for any disparities, and we can use the data to validate those reasons.
So here we show you a chart that sort of illustrates some of the stop activity that occurred from January 1 of 2020 to July 20 of 2021 over this study period. Of course, as we've noted before, there was a huge effect following the stay-at-home restrictions of COVID-19 around March of 2020 that led to a significant decrease in the number of stops that took place in April. There are other events that had an impact that led to an increase in May and then a drop back down in June. So over time, we've been trying to factor in what are some of the reasons for the changes in stops, whether it was due to the COVID-19 pandemic, local police practices, or changes in the types of policies that took place in the local community.
One thing to follow up on the number of stops is we've been starting conversations with the police agencies about whether they're going to go back to the level of January 2020 or not. And I think what we've seen is because of staffing reductions in police agencies and other reconfiguration about what traffic enforcement should be done, we'll probably be at a lower level of stops going forward, which isn't a good or a bad thing, but that recalibrated to the agencies who are involved in Douglas County.
So this figure shows you sort of changes that occur over the time of day. Several studies based on national scholars that have been examining stop activity have noted that some types of stops are more likely to occur at nighttime, some types of stops are more likely to occur in the daytime. One of the things we're taking into consideration is what are those types of stops in the local community area, and how does that match the national characteristics we found in other cities and other counties. Of course, we are carefully looking at this data also broken down by the reason for stop, the outcome of stop, and the race of the individual, realizing that nighttime does change how well an officer is able to perceive who that individual is. And so we're trying to capture some of that information during the study period.
So this is the data from Douglas County from this study. And these are the actual information on what people were stopped for. So you can look and say that majority of the stops, or the largest category of stops, were for people speeding and speeding 10 miles or greater over the speed limit. That's 35% of all the stops in Douglas County. This aggregates the stops done by each individual agency, so you can sort of see that. Some of the terms that might be familiar to you, APB or BOLO is all points bulletin or be on the lookout. And as you can see, that's less than 0.3% of the stops, so there aren't that many stops for that. But equipment violations, where someone has a headlight out, a tail light out, dragging a muffler, whatever, is almost 19% of the reasons for stop. So you get a sense for how that is. One of the places that we had some confusion during the study was the other traffic violation down there. And we see 20% of the stops are other traffic violations. What we did was go back to the agencies and said, can you specify that in a little bit more detail? And the agencies added a new field and were able to have officers say, what kind of other traffic stop? And so the most common one is failure to stop at a stop sign or rolling through a stop sign. But what we'll be doing as the next step is taking some of those that we were able to categorize as an equipment violation or a moving violation and moving them back into the right place in the other categories. So it'll be a cleaner sort of basis for a stop with less other traffic violations. So the outcome of the stop, and we do this around the country, and you've all heard me say this before. Kansas is very nice. That's a good thing. That you can see there that just about 70% of the stops result in a verbal or written warning. If I was to show you the data from Boston Police Department, it'd be about 80% of the stops result in a citation. So there are differences across the country. There's differences in different kinds of jurisdictions and how much what the different actions are. Again, you might not be familiar with NTA, that's notice to appear or a summons to come into court, where you don't have to have an arrest, you're going to appear in court on your own volition. But you can see 22.3% are citation. And in a minute, Jan's going to tell you about that. But one of the questions is, do people get treated differently by race or ethnicity or gender in terms of who gets a citation and who gets a warning? And that's part of the question of, are there disparities in this kind of decisions by police officers? Go ahead. Got it. So this is the reason for a search. As you can see, there were searches conducted. We had 16,000 traffic stops that were conducted during this period. So there's a lot of traffic stops that were done. And a little over 1,001 had a search or a frisk associated with it. And that's 6.2% of the stops. So it's relatively rare for a search to be conducted. But that's true across the country as well, to give you a national context for this. But it's not enough to know that whether there was a search conducted. You have to be able to know why the search was conducted. So you can see here that in the table, there's 5 different reasons for a search. One is consent, that the operator gave consent for the officer to search their vehicle. Another one is probable cause, that the officer had probable cause. In other words, he rolled down the window and smelled drugs or saw drugs on the seat or saw alcohol on the seat. And a Terry frisk, which is a frisk of the outer clothing of an individual who's under suspicion with reasonable articulable suspicion, and that led to a search. There are 2 in red there, and they're inventory, tow, and search incident to arrest. And the reason that they're in red is that in a police department, those searches are not discretionary. Consent, probable cause, and Terry frisk are discretionary decisions by the police officer to this, I'm going to conduct a search. But in search incident to arrest, the person being put under arrest maybe because they have an outstanding warrant, and that to put them in arrest, policy at the police department would be, I have to conduct a search to protect the officer and to protect the individual. Similarly, if you're going to seize a car because the person's driving without a license or drunk driving or whatever, then you have to conduct a search of the vehicle to make sure that all of the things that are in the vehicle are returned to the owner when they get their car back. So those allow, and Janice is going to talk about this, us to think about what's the most discretionary searches and what are the least discretionary searches, so we can look at discretionary searches separately. Do you want to do this one? So here's what was found as you think about searches in Douglas County. The most common thing that was found in the car with drugs or drug paraphernalia, 39, almost 40% of the time. Firearms were found, illegal firearms were found 4.4% of the time. You have alcohol 14% of the time. With the college community that you have here, it may be not surprising. And one of the things that's important is 42% of the searches didn't find anything. Now, compared to other sections of the country and other police departments, Douglas County is pretty good at searching and finding things. They're higher than average. To the 58% of the time they find something in their searches. But we also have to pay attention to those searches where somebody's searched and nothing's found, because that's a real place where we lose trust between the police department and the community. They were pulled over by the police search their car, the police don't find anything, and they may send them on their way, or they may give them a citation. But for the person that searched, it's, why did you suspect me? What was it that made me be suspicious to you? And in fact, I hadn't done anything wrong and you didn't find anything. So it erodes trust between the police and the community, and those searches are important to document. And we're going to be drilling down to try to find out where those are happening and in what kinds of cases. Go ahead.
So in this next slide, as we'll talk about it, as Jack mentioned it, we're going to start using internal benchmarks, which we'll show you. And then in the future, we'll talk about external benchmarks, looking at some of the racial differences for those residents stops against the census population, the driving population, eligible driving population. In looking at the internal benchmarks, we start comparing sort of apples and oranges to oranges. We're trying to look at some of the post-stop activity, such as citations, searches, search outcomes, because these are sort of what illustrates what impacts individuals the most and what draws concern the most from the community members. So in trying to illustrate some of the post-stop activity analysis, I sort of use this figure to provide you with an explanation. We begin by the discussion by saying that disparities do not equal discrimination. Disparities allow us an opportunity to begin identifying areas that require further examination given the complex factors that leads to stops. A number of different factors lead to stops, the basis and the reason for stops, which is captured in the data, the location, the time of day, the call received can also impact the reason for a stop or the outcome of the stop. So if we were in sort of an ideal world, right, and able to capture this in an experiment, our determination that of the total number of stops that were conducted on white drivers and the total stops conducted on people of color, if we were to capture the percent within each that was either cited or searched, our expectations would be that it would be equal, that no matter what had happened, that the equal percent would be cited, equal percent would be searched for both groups within that category. Now, there's other factors that could take place based on the basis for stop, the call that had been received prior to that. But this is sort of just a clean cut copy of looking at where are the initial disparities and what should we be digging into a little bit deeper. So in looking at the data, the total number of stops conducted on white drivers was about 12,234, and the stops on the people of color was 3,700, around 3,700. Both of them had about 22.1, 22.3% who were cited. So there's about a 0.2% difference between these two, and we'll illustrate that disparity in a figure. But ideally, our expectations would be that these would be perfect, which they're closely aligned together. So the thought is that if a police officer is pulling a white driver over and a police officer is pulling a person of color over, then they're both likely to get a citation. Of course, controlling for other factors could lead to different outcomes, but this is sort of our understanding that both groups are equally being cited at the same time. Sorry, go ahead.
So in Douglas County, just to reiterate what Janice said, you know, it's just about, you're just about as likely to get a citation whether you're a white or person of color versus a warning in the stop. And now Jen's going to pull us back to looking at the search numbers and what happens there.
So in looking at the data for searches, of course, searches have serious implications for the driver's subject. And so we determined that based on the percent of those individuals of whites who are searched, we have about 5.3% who are searched. In general, as we had illustrated, there's about a 6% who gets searched across all of Douglas County. When we look at the total stops of the people of color, we have about 9.2% who are searched, of including all searches combined. And so there's about a little over a 3-4% disparity, a little under 4% disparity between these two. And we'll illustrate that again in a figure. But as we noted, some of the things that go into the decision-making behind searches can lead to what we divide between non-discretionary searches and discretionary searches. So when we start looking at discretionary searches, which, as Jack had noted, excludes those searches that are incident to an arrest, because our understanding are searches that are incident to arrest are non-discretionary. We pull some of those numbers out and sort of pull only from those searches what we consider to be discretionary searches. We find that about 3.8% of whites undergo a discretionary search, and about 7.2% of people of color undergo a discretionary search. Now, if we dig a little bit further and we pull out what we consider extra discretionary searches, and those are searches that exclude searches incident to an arrest and those that exclude inventory tows, which we consider to be non-discretionary, we find that 3.8% of whites undergo an extra discretionary search, and about 7.1% of people of color undergo an extra discretionary search, leading to a disparity.
And just to follow up on what Janice said, sometimes you hear, not here in Douglas County, I haven't heard it, but in other places we've worked, well, you got to expect that search is going to be different because people commit crimes at different levels. Well, what Janice has just described is taking out people who have warrants and taking out people who might be driving without a license. Those are the most discretionary searches, and yet the disparity still remains. So there is a place here we want to drill down and work with the agencies to say, when are those happening? To whom are they happening? And how might we be able to develop a plan together to address them?
So this figure illustrates sort of a combined effort of what we showed you in the previous graphs, where you find 3.9% of a disparity in those searches between people of color and whites, and that 3.4% for both discretionary and extra discretionary searches between the people of color and whites. And of course, in looking at cases in which no contraband is found, we find that there is a 1.4%, and that is of the searches in which a search was conducted and no evidence was found. One of the things that Jack had mentioned, of course, our effort is to dig a little bit deeper in order to identify where these searches are occurring, when they're occurring, who is conducting these searches, and what are the policy implications behind them, and what can we think about moving forward as we consider. One of the biggest areas that we find across the country is that there are huge racial disparities in search activity. This falls right in line with some of the findings we're finding in other countries, in other parts of the country, in which we find that, for example, African Americans are 3 times, 4 times, 5 times more likely to undergo a search, discretionary search, or extra discretionary search in some areas. And so we start having these similar conversations that are found in other parts of the country and consider, well, what are some of the best evidence-based practices that exist that some police agencies are starting to conduct that can be similarly adopted in this particular area? And then what can we do moving forward to continue examining and exploring this data to ensure that, this disparity grows smaller over time?
And just to follow up on what Gina said, sometimes you'll see that these disparities are the result of unconscious bias by a police officer. When we do training of police officers and we say to them that, the data on drug use across the United States says that whites are more likely to use drugs and abuse drugs than African Americans or Latinos or Latinx groups, they generally are incredulous and they say, oh, no, that can't be right, because it doesn't fit their stereotype. So sometimes when you start to drill down on this, you can find that individual officers might be using unconscious bias. And if that's the case, it's something you can deal with. because you can alert the officer to what they've been doing, and you can also monitor that officer going forward to make sure that their behavior does change. There could also be systemic bias that might be over-policing of a particular neighborhood or jurisdiction where searches are being done, and trying to let the agencies know whether or not those searches are productive or those searches are reducing crime, and make a policy decision about whether those searches should continue in that area. So I think that this is the beginning of a conversation with the CJCC as well as with the agencies as to try to understand these disparities and trying to move forward in that conversation.
So of course, some of the next steps we plan to engage in are, one, calculating some of the external benchmarks and other internal benchmarks that we can begin looking at. For example, agencies that are involved in more speeding stops that lead to a citation. Are there large disparities? Our expectation that is that if a white driver is pulled over for speeding in an area, then they are likely to receive a citation that equally would also lead to a person of color receiving a citation or receiving a warning, and if that were the case. And so we start trying to examine what are some of the reasons for these stops being conducted, where are they conducted, what time of day are they being conducted, what policies may have inadvertently led to these results. Of course, the data collection and analysis, as we mentioned earlier, will continue through the end of December of 2021. There were huge gaps in the data during the period of end of March, early April, right around 2020, that led us to sort of a request for an extension in the data collection. And so we're hoping that by the winter time, by early 2022, we would begin conducting the analysis to provide the report to the agencies, engaging in some of the conversations with the agencies, and thinking about what are some of the best practices that the agencies can involve themselves in.
And one other set of analyses we're going to be running is analysis that talks about what happened during COVID. We know that there was a dramatic reduction in the number of stops across all the agencies. So that poses a question, which stops were so serious that officers decided they had to move forward and make the traffic stop? Now, one would hope that they would be the most dangerous traffic violations, people speeding at high rates of speed through populated areas or some other kind of behavior that could put people at risk. But there has been community folks across the country who suggested that unconscious bias may have been that if certain individuals of different races or ethnicities were involved, that was more likely to be seen as a serious stop and stopped. So we have a sort of natural experiment here where we can look at before and after the big reduction in stops during COVID to see if the kind of stops were different and if they involved any kind of disparities in sort of who was deemed serious enough to stop during that period.
Now, as we mentioned earlier, this, of course, is the beginning of a conversation. There are over 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country, very few who are starting to collect the data, many who are at the moment considering and having conversations about collecting their data, whether it's mandated or whether it's on a voluntary basis. One of the things we think this is a great opportunity to consider is, while we're capturing based on the measurements, based on some of the variables we've already requested that the officers to collect, there are other opportunities for agencies or for communities to consider what are other things that we can do. Obviously, many consider one of the biggest issues are the way police officers are treating citizens. While that is not measured in this study, there are opportunities for communities to consider. Is there an opportunity to consider what type of behavior police officers are engaging in during that stops that can be gathered from citizen surveys or community surveys, for example? That is something that we're not measuring in the study, but other agencies can consider. Similar to the body-worn camera footage, so many cities and so many communities are gathering information based on the body-worn camera footage. That information is not collected in the study, but this is an opportunity to sort of, one, educate both agencies and educate communities on what are the type of stop activity that are currently taking place in Douglas County. How does that compare to the national level? And what are other communities doing in order to engage in these discussions, move forward, and sort of address some of the disparities or any of the challenges that they find that should otherwise not be there?
And one of the points I'm talking about moving forward, part of the project is to transition our analytic tools back to the county so that when we're done in December of this particular project, the county and the police departments can continue to collect this data and have an ongoing conversation with the community about what they're seeing. Are they seeing changes? Are the disparities that have been observed in the study going down? You know, but it's not something that is planned to stop. It's something that's a new way the police departments can monitor how they interact with the community. And, you know, our hope is that police departments will continue to collect this data and share it with the county, and the county will be doing the kind of analysis we do, or maybe even better analyses as they move forward.
All right, so we're going to open it up to questions. Before you ask, though, one thing I do want to point out is one of the way this study has been designed is that all of our law enforcement agencies are receiving this same information now. And for the purpose of utilizing the expertise of Jack and Janice and their years of experience to help our agencies drill down on data more specifically, and then also to develop plans and understand best practices for reducing those disparities in the future. So that'll be a big part of our work this fall, is continuing to work with them on this project. And so we're actually really excited about that opportunity. And I'm going to open it up for questions.
I'll go ahead and jump in. This is Commissioner Shannon Portillo. In true academic form, this may be more of a comment than a question. I do really appreciate the data that you're sharing. I really appreciate that this study is happening. One of the things that we see from these data is that Douglas County isn't really unique, that we actually are following a lot of the national trends when it comes to stops and a lot of the national trends when it comes to racial disparities. One thing that I find really interesting with this study is that we're just kind of proving that we have the same kind of systemic racism that we see in other areas affecting our community. And so I'm really happy that we're collecting these data. I'm happy that we have a plan, but I think that this should also help us think through some of the other spaces within our criminal legal system where we tend to think that we might be unique or different than other communities, that these data really show that we're reflective of many of these national trends that we see in other spaces. But I'm happy to hear that our law enforcement agencies will continue to collect data past this study's end.
Thank you, Commissioner. Two things. That I think you're right that this is showing that individuals are, that the agencies in Douglas County aren't dramatically different than the agencies around the rest of the country, and that we're seeing similar kinds of disparities or areas of disparity. But it is the one thing that is different, and I think you should feel good about it, is that they're looking at it. There's thousands of police departments across the country that aren't looking at their data, don't want to look at their data, don't believe there's a problem. And I think that one thing about Douglas County is now we can measure it, we can see if there are problems and plan to make a decline in the disparities.
No more questions?
Oh, I have a question.
Okay, Darren, go ahead.
Hi, Darren Kennedy. I'm one of the community members. Some of this maybe was sort of built in, but I know that there are next steps. And one of the slides that I kind of zeroed in on and kind of been thinking about is the point being made that disparity does not equal discrimination. And so I'm wondering from a statistical, from a data standpoint, again, numbers and data are not me. I'm a playwright. Good luck, God bless for me on that. What are the steps? What are the questions? The things that have to be understood to know whether or not the disparities that you do see are discrimination? Are we at that point? If we're not at that point, to be able to ascertain that, what do we have to do to get to that point to know whether or not that's what we're looking at?
I think that's absolutely what we're starting to look at. One of the things when we talk about the various different factors, for example, are some of the policies in place, right? We've known from several different practices across the country that some law enforcement policies inadvertently lead to high levels of disparities that could potentially lead to some officers giving them an opportunity to lead to discrimination, right? Those are some of the things that we're taking into consideration. What policies were in place that led to some of the large disparities? Is it one individual officer? Is it an agency? Is it because of a call that followed up and led to that issue? And then was it the time of day? Was it the location? Was it the address? Is it because we were in a community that was largely made up of people of color that could have led to this outcome? Those are some of the things that we're taking into consideration and we will continue looking at. And yes, while disparities do not lead to discrimination, there is some evidence that the further in we dig, if we were able to control for various different factors and that disparity continues to exist, then we would raise red flags around that, right? To consider, is this an issue in terms of discrimination? Darren, does that answer your question?
It does, and I guess just a brief follow-up. So is that sort of red flagging that you just sort of alluded to in terms of saying, hey, pointing that out to us, is that part of the scope of your work to
That
to
is absolutely the scope of our work. This is sort of the beginning where we're having these conversations. These are data that we've been meeting around with several law enforcement agencies right now, trying to present and understand why was there a sudden increase in stop activity in one particular month? Why was there a sudden decrease? Why was there a sudden increase in speeding details? What was going on around that time period? What was going on in this particular location? Because the data we are receiving is quite rich in the fact that we're able to geocode and actually narrow down into what communities, what areas, what blocks seem to lead to a greater number of stops that are taking place depending on the type of stop. So that's definitely something within our scope of work that we look forward to continuing doing.
And just to give one more follow-up to that is in a study we were doing in Boston with a colleague, we looked at the stop and frisk. Specifically, they were doing a stop and frisk program there of pedestrians. And they said, well, that's because we concentrate on gang members. And in Boston, gang members were generally people of color. And we looked at it and did an analysis of that and found that, yes, that was true for a lot of the stops, but there was still discrimination and disparities left over. And the department then moved on to try to understand and deal with those. So it's a dialogue that we get into with the departments to try to get to a positive place.
I thought Patrick had his hand up. Patrick, did you have a question?
No, it's been answered. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure which of the three of you went next. I didn't catch it.
Chuck.
Go ahead, Chuck. Okay, good, Chuck.
Oh, thank you. I want to thank Professors McDevitt and Iwama for this presentation. It's very clear and I think very helpful and really informative for our public discussions here. I think we also ought to thank the police agencies for stepping up and taking the initiative to carry this study out. That's a really, really important development in our community. I do have a couple of questions, and this may be going beyond professors what you'd like to talk about today, but do you have data specifically on racial disparities in Terry stops, as you call them? Those are the stop and frisk of a person of a pedestrian on the street. And a second question is, can you tell us what are the numbers of searches by agency within Douglas County?
Thanks, Chuck. And it's good to see you again. Yeah, we do have we'll be looking at the data by each category of search. So we look at Terry stops, but we're also going to look at probable cause because that's also a problematic category. Sometimes probable cause is in the eye of the police officer who makes the decision. So we'll be looking at it there. We will be eventually releasing the data on all of the individual agencies. But initially we wanted to give it to them so that they could take a look at it and tell us where we might be misunderstanding their policies or where their officers, work with them to try to see if we can understand their officers. But at the individual level, we'll be looking at, the final report will have agency level data on, searches and disparities for each of the 5 agencies.
Yeah, and Chuck, just really quickly to address your question, pedestrian stops made up about less than 8% of the data. There were only about 700. And so given the fact that a very few of those actually underwent a tariff risk, our understanding is probably because of COVID. There were actually very few pedestrian stops that experienced a search. Most of those were followed up from a traffic stop. So the data is very small, but as we continue sort of moving forward, depending on how things go, not that I'm sure we'll reach a norm, but we'll continue exploring that data and examining and just keeping an eye out.
And just to follow up one more time, that we were asked by a couple of the chiefs already to look at the pedestrian stops separately because they wanted to know what those issues were that people were being stopped for. So we'll be looking at that specifically.
Okay, thank you very much. I just also have one question by way of clarification of the patterns. You emphasized that the disparity in discretionary and extra discretionary stops is about 3.4%. But I wonder if wouldn't a more conventional way of characterizing that difference be what is the difference between the Black proportion who are searched and the white proportion? And that difference is actually 190%, or put it another way, African Americans are about twice as likely to be searched. I think that would be the more conventional way of expressing that difference. Is that correct?
It is correct in this data, and I think you're right. We wanted to sort of be true to each of the tables and use the percentages that were in them, but that's why we're going to report it. The likelihood is of being searched given different race and ethnicity groups to the extent we can with the numbers. Then that, but yes, you're twice as a person of color, you're twice as likely to be searched in Douglas County on a car stop than a white person.
Mario, would you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Maria Ferrero, I'm a community representative, and I'd like to thank Doug for bringing that to our attention, because I think sometimes if you're explaining data, it may not be comprehensive to someone who comes from a non-academic background. And so my question is going to be a little bit on those lines, because I was thinking about this, and some of the data does not add up to the 100%. And so I was wondering if there was any data we weren't able to collect, or if there's any explanation behind some of the stats not maybe fully encompassing that percentage.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely true. Some of the data did not lead to 100%. It actually led to over that. And the reason for that is agencies and officers were able to select more than one option. That happened on rare occasions where an officer would note, well, there was, for example, speeding and also an equipment violation when they conducted that stop. That's why some of those opportunities, they were very rare. Most officers selected one option, but in opportunities that officers were able to select that it was due to a speeding, for example, equipment violation, that's why they don't add to a perfect 100%. That's correct.
Perfect. That makes complete sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Marielle. And Shay, I believe you're next.
Thank you. I was going to request, I know that part of the next step is that we're going to look at this by neighborhood. And I wanted to first find out if we have an idea of when we'll be able to tell which neighborhoods are being addressed at which time, when we might have answers for that. And then the other question I have is, if I understand the data collection, then a person of color is twice as likely to be stopped and searched, but there are more instances, even percentage wise, where they have found nothing. Am I understanding it correctly?
Just as I might rephrase it slightly, they're twice as likely to be searched, and they're more often in those searches they're not found anything on the individual.
Correct.
Yes, and with regards to the final report, Shay, I don't want to ignore your first question. We're planning on including some of the information that we have from the geocoding to identify the neighborhoods that seem to find the greatest number of stops, and those neighborhoods that we find the greatest number of searches and disparities in the final report.
Okay. So in December?
Correct.
Did you have anything else, Shay?
No, I think those were my two. If you were restating what I said and that is still true, then yes. Meaning they're twice as likely to be searched And even percentage wise, they are more likely to not find anything as a result of that search.
That's exactly right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tamara, I believe your hand is up next.
In regard to probable cause, what are the guidelines that would govern whether a police officer believes they need to stop or frisk or cite a person, other than personal discretion? What do we know about how an officer would justify stopping or handling a person? And is this an area that needs to be revisited as a part of training?
Thank you, Tamara. There's people on the call who are more adept at answering the probable cause question, but an officer has to be able to say what factors led that officer to believe that a crime was about to be committed or had been committed, and be able to articulate those facts to a judge. So it isn't, I just suspected something. They have to be able to say, I smelt the smell of marijuana. I saw this person coming out of a building that just reported a crime. So they have to be able to articulate what it is that made them be suspicious of that individual.
Ms. Cash, maybe I can help just a touch as well. Probable cause is one of the things that has been litigated, taught, trained, talked about, and covered extensively throughout my law enforcement career, because it's something that the high courts, the Supreme Courts have ruled on and moved on and talked about and discussed for many, many years. So the main thing that from a street level police officer's understanding is that you have to have reasonable suspicion in order to stop a vehicle. That means that a reasonable person would believe that something may be going on, whether that be a tag light out or something like that. Probable cause requires more proof, so to speak. And what it is that any reasonable person would believe that a crime is being committed, and it is being committed by this person. So therefore, I will give the example of, as Dr. McDivitt talked about, walking up to a vehicle that you've stopped for some other reason, say we'll just use a headlight. You've stopped somebody for a headlight out, walk up, roll their window down, and you immediately smell the odor of burnt marijuana. Well, that automatically right there has gone from reasonable suspicion to probable cause, where I know what marijuana smells like and I recognize the smell. So therefore, I have probable cause to believe that there is something that created that smell within that vehicle. So it's, and I may not be explaining it very well, but probable cause is something that you can actually define it, prove it, show it, and it's what we have to show in order for somebody to be charged, as well as for a search warrant to be issued. Because what we fill out is what we call a probable cause affidavit, where we have to explain what it is, the reasons why we believe that this person is committing this crime at this time at this place. So I hope I've helped. I may have talked myself into complete circles, but so I apologize.
Well, I totally understand what you're saying, but how do we justify then the searches that present no resultant evidence?
That's a great question. I think we all on this call want to know why that happens.
If I may interject, one potential way that does occur is to follow the sheriff's example. If an officer stops a car for an equipment violation or speeding or whatever reason, reasonable suspicion's been articulated, driver rolls down the window and the officer smells the odor of burnt marijuana, which they've been trained on and had a demonstration of at some point in their career. If they were to search that vehicle and not locate any marijuana in that car, that could be an indication of nothing found. There could obviously be other things at play, but there are some other ways that could be. Alcohol being something similar. If an officer pulls somebody over and smells the odor of alcohol coming from their person, does a search of the car, but doesn't locate any bottles or anything like that, that could give an indication of nothing found. Again, there's a lot of potential there that could be, but I wouldn't go down the road that every search that doesn't yield evidence is a bad search. It could be, but it doesn't necessarily mean one or the other.
Well, I'm hoping as we go forward with analysis that we will look at these stops and searches and find out more about what were their circumstances, because this degree of disparity warrants further questions.
Yeah, absolutely, Chairman. That is the plan.
Yeah, excellent point. Shay, I saw you raise your hand the old-fashioned way. Do you have another question?
Well, no, I think they addressed it. I was just going to say that basically Ms. Cash has hit the nail on the head. Frankly, there is a lot of discretion that an officer has, but all of us have questions about when it is the officer's discretion that is then authorizing these further searches. What are they specifically looking for that they find suspicious? Because it's a, we don't know if it's correlated or not. What we do know is that brown people are being searched twice as often. So something is being articulated by those officers in those instances, which is justified, at least in their minds, a search of these vehicles. So what I was really just going to say is that there is no sort of standard set of these 5 things or these 10 things. It's the officer's perception as a whole on the entirety to determine what's going on. So for instance, you may have a different suspicion if you're stopping somebody at 3 a.m. versus 3 p.m. But that I think that though is the point, is there seems to be some discretion there that's leading to, at least on paper, a result that doesn't seem to line up.
Absolutely. Shannon, I think this is sort of obviously a broader conversation when we talk about sort of what we view as suspicion when we talk about sort of widespread racism in the United States, right? I think the biggest issue here is that it creates a criminal history record. It creates a record for individuals, which is why it has such a bigger impact when we start looking at police activity. I mean, more broadly speaking, when we think about what is viewed as suspicious, obviously, a person of color is more likely to be viewed as suspicious. That's something that we discuss, broadly in most, race and crime classes, for example. But this is something that is a bigger impact because it actually can create a trail for somebody and affect them later on in the future. So that's definitely something we are vigilant about.
Chuck, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Professors McDevitt and Iwama, do you, in the data that you have on probable cause searches, do you have any data on the particular justifications within that category? So for example, several people here have given the example of smelling marijuana. Would that be captured in any kind of open response data in those forms, or is it just a probable cause as an entire category? And the reason I ask is that at least it's my understanding that in some jurisdictions, the smelling marijuana probable cause is regarded as a highly discretionary one. It's effectively impossible to capture that evidence and provide it in any sort of documentable form, unlike, for example, a bottle of whiskey that's half drunk that's on the seat next to the driver. There is physical evidence. You can retain it. You can use it to show what you found and so forth. Whereas the smell is ephemeral. It's there and it's gone, and it's a judgment call in a way. And so my basic question is, do we know what are the particular reasons that fall under that probable cause category? And thank you.
Thanks, Chuck. Couple things. You're absolutely right about the marijuana one. In Massachusetts, for example, marijuana is legal. So if a police officer makes a stop and rolls down the window and smells marijuana, there's nothing the police officer can do about it, unless it's over a certain amount of marijuana in the car. But generally speaking, that's not going to be something that they enforce. But unfortunately, we don't have that further data on probable cause. But interestingly enough, at one of the police departments today, we had a conversation of the need to do that. So one of the things that this group could be really helpful with as we move forward is, as we transition this to the county in January, I think it's an opportunity to add some more fields of data we don't want to overwhelm the officers collecting too much data, but some more things that would help us dig down deeper into the areas of concern. And this might be one where we start to say, what was the factors that gave you probable cause? And can we have that articulated? Another place that might be an addition that I think might be helpful is when we did the original form, we collected whether the person was a resident of Douglas County versus not Douglas County, but another Kansas County versus out of state. It might also be important to know, from comparison purposes, to know whether the person's a resident of Baldwin City or Lawrence or Eudora, because that helps to sort of drill down on what the population estimates might be for the jurisdiction. So that's something we've talked to the agencies as well about, sort of thinking about how we might enhance the data to be able to answer some of the questions that we have. And this group would be so helpful to sort of help us think that through as what additional fields we should collect.
Yeah, and we're happy to include it, in the final report, sort of how do we make this data richer? Because we have to understand when we started this, there was no race data collection. So we definitely started from zero to a lot, now having sort of a data collection from which to begin a foundation, but sort of thinking moving forward, as agencies continue collecting this information, there are several variables that we would absolutely be happy to recommend in the final report that agencies and the communities could consider, and so many more that you yourselves can also come up with that you think that would help improve the understanding of what exactly is taking place, allow agencies better information, allow the communities with more information about what exactly is going on and how to address these issues.
Mario, question?
Yes, thank you. One last question. This is Maria Ferreiro. So on the collection of the gender, race, ethnicity, is that all based on the perception of the police officer from the reports? None of it is based on voluntary information given by the subjects that are being pulled over or anything like that? It's all based on the perception of the officers, correct?
That is correct, because our assumption is that officers are engaging in such a way based on who they perceive you to be, who, not necessarily who you might actually be, right? We think about this with many, for example, white Latinx, right? If you happen to be pulled over, the officer might engage and perceive you to be an individual of a white person, even though you happen to be Latinx, or they might actually perceive you to be Latinx and write that. The importance of this was in order to capture sort of how officers were engaging in based on their perceptions, not who you actually are, whether or not that fell in line with your gender or sexual orientation, for example, your race. So
Got
that
it.
was sort of important for us to capture. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
That's excellent clarification. Appreciate you making that.
This has been a great conversation. Do we have any more questions or comments? Thank you, Dr. Iwama, and thank you, Dr. McDevitt. This has been great. Moving on to our next agenda item, it's Sheriff Armbruster is going to give us an update on the jail.
I'm going to try. Let's just say that.
While the sheriff's pulling his screen up, I do note that we have an attendee who would like a question, and we do take public comment at the end of the meeting. So if you'll be patient with us, we'll get to your question or comment before the meeting's over. Thank you. Sheriff, go ahead.
Okay. Am I showing the right screen or? Mike, help.
You're showing the presenter view. I don't know if you
Okay.
can.
Okay. Let's see if I can.
If we have to, we can work with that, Sheriff.
Yeah, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. All right, let's go back to number one. Okay, so Mike has asked me to just kind of start giving more of a snapshot of our current jail standing and population. So I'm more than happy to do it, but before I get to the numbers, I want to again talk about a few things, what we look at. And if you've listened to me for any amount of times, you've heard me talk about functional capacity. So our jail, our facility is an 186 bed facility. Of that 186 beds, well, and I'll get to that in another, but our maximum our special management or medium pods are all full currently. And the maximum of special management are 28 total, and the medium pod is 56, I believe, total. We have moved some classifications around into different housing units, and we currently have 15 housed out of county, but a lot of those are for mental health treatments in other institutions and facilities. We are not housing out of county the way we were previously, just simply for overcrowding. We are, I like to use the term treading water right now. We're doing pretty well. As of today, we have 130 some odd folks in our facility. So of our 186 beds, 74 of those beds are not secured. So that's kind of the crux of where I want to talk about the difference between functional capacity and actual capacity. While we have a bed, there's 74 of them that are not behind a locked door, or if they are behind a door, they do not have a toilet facility within that room for them. So the door is not locked, so they can use a shared shower toilet facility on their floor. With the changing of our demographic and classifications of persons currently experiencing in custody, we are unable to use those cells the way that they were initially designed. So we have people who are not able to be used in the minimum classification that would allow them to have one of these unsecured beds or cells. So therefore, a lot of these beds are of no use to us most of the time, if not all of the time now. The work release facility is 46 beds, and we tend to stay around 15 to 20 people in there. So that's even pushing that. So we end up with 20 empty beds that we just flat can't use. So, I'll be glad to talk more about all that into the future. And when we get into the graphs here, I'm going to rely on Brower and Dr. Cravens to kind of go through these. I don't claim to be the data guy, so I'll let them explain these.
Thank you, Sheriff. So this slide shows the bookings by month, and we reached a high of 438 in March of 2019. And after COVID hit, that dropped pretty dramatically. We see in April of 2020, that number of bookings by month was 128. It's been steadily creeping up, and now it's at about 235. So there's a lot of variation here because there's just sort of random fluctuations, but we are at a little bit higher rate than we were about a year ago. Next slide. Mike, do you want to?
Sure, I'll take this. This is Mike. I'll take this one, Matt. So from the year 2000, when we opened the current facility, until the year 2008, so that's 19 actual years of data, our average jail bookings per year were 5,668, with a high of 6,392. That was, by the way, the only time we went over 6,000, and a low of 5,174. If you look at the last 3 years for 2019, this is prior to the pandemic, our bookings that year were 4,353, which is dramatically lower, in fact, more than a 20% lower than our previous 19-year average. In 2022, as we saw, there you really see the impact of the pandemic, with the annual bookings were 2,794. And so we're watching this to want to know, is this replicable? Can we continue to keep bookings low? And so with the projecting out, we've only completed 7 months, but projecting for 12 months, we're looking at 3,249 bookings as an estimate for here in 2021. So it's important that we're keeping these numbers low, and we just wanted to show that to you. Next slide, please.
This figure shows the average daily population in Douglas County Correctional Facility by month. And So we see in 2019 a pretty high number there. We reached 236 inmates in August and September of 2019. After COVID, that did drop to about 138 in April of 2020, and it's been steady, between about 138 and 150 since then. So the jail population hasn't jumped back up as we thought it might when courts opened. It is still at about 150. Oh, all right, my mic was off. So this figure shows the average length of stay. It's on our bookings and offenses dashboard, and it did steadily creep up from 2017 to 2020, but we did see the average drop pretty considerably so far in 2021 to about 16 days. One thing to note, and we'll see this in the next slide, is that even though the average is about 16 days, most people booked are released in about 24 to 78 hours. So what we see is that 71% of persons booked are released in 72 hours or less. There are, people staying longer, and that drives up the average. And in fact, if you look at just the standing jail population, people do stay a lot longer because you get, the people who are there for a longer time. But for the bookings, a lot of people are coming and going. Mike, do you want to jump in on this?
So as you saw 2 slides ago, that our current length of stay was equal to what it was back when we had the highest jail capacity in 2017 of 231 inmates, so almost 100 inmates more than we currently have. But currently, length of stay is about the same for both of those. And we believe that that has a significant part to do with that our court is continuing to try to catch up after months of being shut down from the pandemic and reduced operations following the shutdown. And so we do want to point out, we know that our district attorney and the district court and our defense attorneys have been really working aggressively to try and help us get caught up with these trials. But they are impacting where the jail population is today. And as you see here with the pie charts, that our current pretrial only population is 85% of the jail population. Previous to the pandemic, we were usually around 50 to 55% of our population was pretrial. So that's a number to watch on, but it also creates opportunity as we are able to successfully eliminate the backlog with court cases and jury trials, that we believe that the pretrial population will drop, and overall the jail population will drop. And so that's the goal and target we're watching for. Also on the you don't have to go back, Sheriff, but the other slide did show that this is from the Sheriff's data dashboard, and it does show the type of offense that the most serious offense that people are in custody for, and that's just for your information. And finally, the last slide. This again will show you the impact that the pandemic has had on our court system. And so not only has the pretrial population increased in the jail, but also, and the length of stay, but also the pretrial population has increased with our pretrial release program. And you'll see here that this is the average number of months that someone is on pretrial release in the community. And that number has risen steadily since 2019. And so our hope is not only do we decrease the pretrial population in the jail, but we decrease the pretrial population on supervision in the community. So we wanted to, like I said, we want to make sure that we keep this on our radar, and we continue to share the sheriff's data with you. All of the data from, or nearly all of the data from this presentation is actually available on the sheriff's website. So we're trying to be as open and transparent about that as we can. But we also want the council to know that that the sheriff's office is keeping a close eye on this, and as we try to continue to manage the size of our facility during the pandemic. So Sheriff, did you have any final, or Matt?
And I'll make a quick note that some of the figures that you saw are on our new dashboard that we haven't released yet. There's a standing jail population dashboard that's going to accompany the bookings and offenses dashboard and the stepping up initiative dashboard and the bond dashboard. And that will be released in the coming weeks.
Thank you very much, Matt and Mike. So yeah, in closing, really, I'm here to answer any questions you may have, but what I want you to take away from this is that the 186 number is not exactly accurate. Where I start getting a little bit worried about our population is when we get in the 135 to 150 range, which is where we seem to be staying right now. Once it hits 150 is where we're probably gonna have to start looking at housing out of county again as well on a larger scale. The other thing is that I really can't stress enough how much the courts and the partners within the court system, the defense and the prosecutors and the judges really have driven the jail population down for us. We also recognize that there's more work to do there, but it's just the backlog of them getting the system rolling again and getting caught back up. I have a lot of people that are in our facility right now that are simply just waiting for their day in court. And we know that it's taken a long time, but we're trying to get to that place so we can get them on to whatever their next chapter is, and hopefully it's not hopefully it's not in jail. So Pam, I see you have a question.
I had a couple questions. On the chart that talks about the most serious offense that they're in jail for, is that a day and time count? What is that time frame of that chart?
That is a point in time count. So at one point in time, I believe it was August 5th, I think it's about 20% of people's most serious offense was a FTA. A large majority was a felony, and so on and so forth. So it's a point in time count.
Okay, thank you. The other question I had was, at one time we had seen data that probation violations were a big user of the jail PVs. What is the status on that? I didn't see that in any of the charts.
Oh, there's a different figure that's going to be released on the new dashboard that shows the specific offense that people are being held for in the jail, and probation violation is one of those, and that will be on that. But it wasn't on the most serious offense classification.
Okay, thank you.
Pam, that's something I think we will be able to follow up with you on a regular basis on those numbers, or Holly over at probations. As Matt's been putting this new dashboard together, it'll just increase some of our data that we can see. So we would definitely talk about that. Darren, you got a question?
Yeah, Sheriff, this is actually a question for you. And this may have come up, but I want to make sure that I'm not conflating two things that you're pointing out. When you're talking about functional beds, also in that screen is a note about the effects of COVID-19. So are you saying that those beds are that number of beds is always going forward, just not going to be usable? Or are you anticipating that once we're no longer sort of in pandemic living, that functionality comes back somewhat?
I like your optimism that we're going to ever be out of this pandemic living, but no, great question. So with the pandemic specifically, what we had to do is we had to really reorganize it to allow for quarantine portions. So somebody who has just come in, who we don't know the status of their quarantine or their exposure. On top of that, somebody who has been exposed. And then on top of that, somebody who has actually tested positive, which we only had a very few. So we had to reallocate our spaces to account for that. And that really made things a little bit messy. But since that time, what has really driven the change in our functional capacity is the classification of our current jail population. So the 230 to 250 numbers that you were seeing, there were 30, 40 people on there who were what we would call our minimum classification, and they were either housed out of county or they were housed within a minimum classification or minimum unit or our work release unit, because they were of they were able to be within those units safely. All of those people were the ones that were released and sent back out and are living their lives on the outside, and we're left with the people who are unfortunately unable to really kind of play by the rules. And I don't mean to speak in such broad terms, but we have a more difficult population to manage, and those beds just aren't safe for anybody. So hopefully we never get back to those numbers, the 260s and those kind of numbers, because our systems are in place to keep people out of jail. What I actually envision for me personally is to actually reallocate those spaces into more usable. So our bed number would actually go down. If I had all the money in the world and could do exactly what I wanted, our jail capacity would be about 150 to 175. And that would be a functional capacity of 150 to 175, as opposed to what it is today. So, but it's going to take a lot of work and of course some money and time, but that's my hope. And trending the way things are going right now, I feel comfortable that I think that we're going to be able to maintain that unless something just totally goes haywire. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, it does.
Right,
thank you.
Pam, real quick, if I could just do a brief wrap up to make sure I'm capturing any of the follow-up that the council would like. As far as the law enforcement traffic and pedestrian contact study, the CJCC work group on racial and ethnic disparities, which has owned this project, will be meeting next month to kind of continue to take a deeper dive on the presentation you saw today. They received this presentation yesterday. And Dr. McDevitt has volunteered to attend that meeting via Zoom. So we're going to continue to utilize him. And then each of our law enforcement agencies will be working with Dr. McDevitt and Dr. Imama to continue to work on kind of a personal plan, if you will, drilling down on data and looking at best practices to see what their opportunities are to work to reduce the disparities that we saw today. Is there any other pieces that the council wants to make sure that we're looking at on that project? Yeah, Tamara?
Yes, as a part of the racial and ethnic disparities group, will we be able to look at more specific data on the searches and stops? I have a lingering concern that the data suggests that Black individuals are stopped because they are presumed guilty as opposed to the opposite. And so I hope that we're not going to wait on the outcome of the Northeastern study to begin to look specifically at these areas. That means the county, that means the coordinating council and the racial disparities work group. How can we get our hands on data that will allow us to look more closely? Can we be studying that between now and the next meeting?
So I don't know that I'm the answer to that question, but I don't believe we can. I believe that, and correct me if I'm wrong, from our researchers here, that they will be doing that with the law enforcement agencies first, and then that data won't come to us until Well, and actually that data will go to each agency once the research is complete. So that would be an agency level decision.
Okay, well, I guess my question was directed at, members of our council. And, how we can be more integrally involved in looking at the data and not waiting on the Northeastern data to be completed, especially since that's really not their charge anyway, to look specifically at the stops or the searches
Well, Ms. Cash,
in detail.
is part of the question not just about the data, but what do we do moving forward? Because it sounds
Well,
like
yes.
we have data that's showing that there are practice changes and policy changes that we might want to make. And so,
Well, that's what I'm asking about is what practice and policy are we going to change, and what's guiding these disparities? And I don't think you can answer the question of what's causing these disparities without looking closer than we have already. And I'm not criticizing what Northeastern has done. In fact, they've shed a light for us to use to go forward. But I'm just saying that it seems like we are waiting on, the outcome of their data, which isn't going to really answer our question until we look closely at it. Now, if that means the data department, that's fine. But I just feel like we are in a holding pattern when every day, every week, every year counts for those individuals who are being disenfranchised and presumed guilty as opposed to being innocent.
Well, Ms. Cash, I can only speak for the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, but I have my meeting with Dr. McDivitt and Umama as soon as this is over. And you can bet that I'm going to be looking into all of these things that you're talking about right away. I may not be able to share stuff right away. I may not be able to do a lot of the things I just don't know what we're going to find, but I can promise you that they will be looked at, and we want to know the answers as well. So for now, the best I can tell you is that I intend to look into this right away.
Thank you.
Yeah, Adam Heffley, Lawrence Police Department. I'll jump in to back up what Sheriff said. We met with the group earlier and asked them to further analyze the data that we're talking about here. There's still a lot of unknowns in that data, and I don't want to make analysis decisions without them looking at it, namely, or just for example, geocoding some of these data points to look at, are these certain areas of the city? Is this certain time of day? I think before we start making substantive changes or policy decisions, we need to really pour through the data that's there and do so in an informed way. And that's what we've committed to working on. And I've asked them for those things in a meeting earlier today.
And Tamara, this is Mike Patrick over in Baldwin City. We're also very much on board with this project. So we will also be looking at all the data as well over here in Baldwin City. So thank you.
I see Shay has a question or a comment.
Yeah, more of a question, and that was going to be, and I certainly don't mean to speak for Ms. Cash, but from my standpoint, this data does create like a sense of urgency for me. Like clearly there's something. So my question is really to the chiefs in that, is there something that the council could be suggesting or recommending in terms of additional training or resources or whatever to make sure that we're doing what we can to try to address this? Or is it just a situation where we're just going to wait? I don't want to speak for her, but I think the idea that what I don't want to leave this meeting with is this idea that we're just going to wait until December and then we'll figure out what happens thereafter. And I want to say, I appreciate you guys all looking at it. I mean, this can't be easy to look at and see there's something going on. But if there are things that the council can be recommending or trying to acquire that would assist. I think that's, at least from my standpoint, what I would like to know is if there's something that the council can be doing.
Well, Shay, I think the simplest answer right now is to at least give us an opportunity to look at the numbers, start looking deeper into the numbers and doing a deep dive. Give us, I mean, I agree. It's a sense of urgency, and I understand your point, and it's well taken. But we're going to need a little bit of time just to figure out what it is. Even if the numbers are, show a huge racial disparity, we have to figure out where we're going to do the work. And I want to include all of you, especially, you and I have had a lot of good conversations. So if nothing else, I mean, I know a month sounds a long time, but I have a feeling this is going to be a very big conversation until the next CJCC meeting. And so feel free to reach out, but at least give me, I just saw these numbers today as well. So I think we're all kind of starting at the same point.
Yeah, I'll say this, some of our police agencies saw this information yesterday. Some are seeing it for the first time as you are. And we'll be meeting with Eudora and the sheriff's office this afternoon. So please don't beat them too much on their lack of preparedness to respond to these questions, which I think are fantastic. And I think we should be wrestling with this and figuring out what we can do and where we should go. So I've written this down and we'll be following up. Sarah, did you have a comment?
Yeah, and just maybe to piggyback on that a little bit, Mike. So it sounds like, within the next 30 days, each of the law enforcement agencies will have a chance to sit down with Northeastern and really review the information to date in detail. And then the sheriff mentioned something about the next CJCC meeting, is that, maybe we could just share with the group, are there more steps between now and December that are happening? And just to make sure the group is aware of all those things. And then also, many of these practices and strategies, are there things at the rate that work groups could start working on, continue to work on, to study and analyze options that, as the sheriffs and other law enforcement agencies are able to really get their arms around the data, that we can kind of go down a parallel track and then eventually intersect. Is that making any sense? So we can get them a more detailed calendar about what's happening between now and December. Is that what I hear head nodding for, Mike?
Yeah, that's what my head's nodding for, yes.
Okay, great. Does that end? All right, thank you.
Commissioner Ananda?
I think that one of the things that I'm hoping to see our work group talk about, and maybe Doctors McDevitt and Iwama can speak to where we can begin to parse out the individual behaviors versus the policy behaviors that are contributing to this, and how we can entrust our agencies to address those individual behaviors and the distrust maybe that exists in the belief that will be handled internally, and how we, as the organization that's tasked with making this whole system better, can look at the policies and either make recommendations or at least have conversations about where these policies are creating racism without racist, right? Those institutional structures that even without folks acting on unconscious or conscious bias, there are still going to be disparate outcomes. And I don't know the extent to which what we're collecting here can speak to that or help us parse that out. But I think that would be helpful as well.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Commissioner,
Mario?
just
go ahead, Jack. Go ahead.
Just to follow up, we're going to be starting working, right away when we get back to Boston to get this information back to the agencies and to go back and forth. And I think your distinction between individual level issues and structural policy issues is really important. And so we're going to be going down both those roads at the same time to see if we can identify. It's probably not one or the other, but a little of both when we find it. So, but we'll make a commitment to this group to sort of get that rolling as soon as we get back, feeding that back to the departments.
Mario?
Thank you. This is more of a comment than a question. I think it is pertaining to what Sarah said, what everyone else has been saying on just this sense of urgency is that this is a public meeting. There was a community meeting last night, and I'm not sure of the level of participation. I was unable to attend, but the clarification on what this data actually means is public now to the community, and the community is going to see this very egregious disparity. They're going to see this data and they're going to ask these questions. And so that's why I feel like this is, and I don't want to speak for anybody, but that's why I feel like there's this sense of urgency right now, is that we are, yes, a group that is here to make these processes better. But if we are just providing this data without a clear way of what we're going to do moving forward, then we're answering to the community, and the community is not going to be and shouldn't be happy with this information, this data, because it is continuing to prove the issues that the community has been constantly bringing up. And so I think if there is a way to be more, to open the option to have the community more involved, or at least to inform the community of the steps in the process and what's going to be from now August to December when the study is finished, and what recommendations will come from that, is so crucial, because we are in real life seeing people's lives are going to be continuously affected. This data is not stagnant, it's living. And so I think it's just very important to keep that in mind, that the community will see this, and we will have to respond to that and be very mindful of how we communicate this out.
Thank you, Mario. Tamara?
As we look closer at the various categories of searches, is it possible, as we look closer, to look for patterns in why the individuals are searched? Is there wording? Is there something on a form that indicates why they were searched? I think it would, the numbers would warrant our looking for a pattern there. That's the kind of deeper data that I would like to see.
And Tamara, because we are a little bit over time, and Tamara is a very active member of our work group. You know, I think those are the kind of things that as a work group, we want to bring up with Dr. McDevitt when he meets with us at our next meeting. And so I'm written that down, and you help me remember, and we'll make sure that, well, we're going to make sure he has that right now. But we'll, these are the kind of things that the work group can get into the details on and report back to the CJCC.
This has been great. And you said we had some public comment today?
Any of the attendees want to make public comments? I'm not seeing any responses now, Pam.
All right. Does anybody else have anything for the good of the order today? This meeting's adjourned. We'll see you all at the next CJCC meeting on September 14th. Thank you everyone for attending today.